Shyam, it's a pleasure to be here with you and to be able to talk with you about Palunteer, a company I've seen innovating on the battlefield and at home. So let me get right to it. This audience heard Vice President Vance this morning speak about an American renaissance in manufacturing. You've taken a different post-medieval religious metaphor in your writing about a defense reformation. You proposed 18 theses that you want to nail to the Pentagon wall, Martin Luther style, demanding innovation. And I want to ask you to explain for this audience, without going through 18 theses, the core of your basic question and argument. Why does American defense manufacturing cost so much, and what can be done to start fixing it?
Well, I think at a very fundamental level, look, the 18 theses were my 19 years of accumulated experience trying to crawl across the valley of death and the reflections from doing that. At a very fundamental level, I think everyone, the Chinese, the Russians, have given up on communism except for Cuba and the DoD. We literally have a 5-year plan, the FIDIP. And when I look back at the industrial base we used to have when we were winning World War II, in the early Cold War, it wasn't a defense industrial base, it was an American industrial base. Chrysler built cars and missiles. Ford built satellites until 1990. General Mills, the cereal company, built torpedoes. There was this way in which every car, camera, and cereal box Americans bought was actually subsidizing the R&D around our national security. As a consequence of having won the Cold War, we got more and more comfortable putting our defense industrial base essentially on the Galapagos Islands. We started a process that really started in the 70s, but we kind of really separated commercial innovation from defense innovation. Intel, in I think 68, 69, 96% of Intel's sales were to the Apollo program and to the DoD. But of course, Intel always aspired to be something much bigger than that. They were always playing for a huge commercial market. And because of that, they drove down the price performance of integrated circuits in a way that enabled Assault Breaker 1, that enabled fundamental American prosperity, which is, of course, the point of national security. And so I think this idea of cost plus is just disastrous for innovation. There's no leverage in your business. It robs founders and entrepreneurs of the necessary incentive to invest ahead of the curve in the things that we're going to need. And as someone who grew up in the shadow of the Space Coast, I think there's no better example than space launch. The shuttle used to cost $50,000 a kilogram to get to orbit. Cheaper mechanisms we had were like $20,000 a kilogram. And with Starship Heavy reuse, we're talking about 10 to 20 bucks. No zeros are missing there. And you need that sort of incentive, I think, to power the American industrial base, to reestablish deterrence. That's one of the concepts that we're not really talking about. It's I think empirically, we lost deterrence. And we lost deterrence about a decade ago. We had Crimea was annexed. The Iranians got very, very close to a bomb. We've had a pogrom in Israel. And I think it's a real wake-up call to all of America.
So you write about how, going back to the so-called Last Supper in 1993, when then Defense Secretary Perry told a bunch of prime contractors, sorry, we're going to have to shrink the defense base down to a very few number of prime contractors, that we now have this system with just a few companies that are able to navigate the rules, sort of elaborate procedures of Pentagon procurement. And one question I had reading your essay, which I commend to everybody, is whether you can get to the kind of renaissance in defense manufacturing you're talking about without breaking this system of Pentagon rules and procurement, which is just elaborate. Every one of those rules has a reason. Every member of Congress has a particular reason to object to dismantling a piece of it. So how are you going to do that? In this area, we're watching DOJ try to attack bureaucracy across the government. The Pentagon is particularly difficult because it's so tightly interwoven. How are your company, other smaller startup companies, going to break through?
Well, I think this room is a reason for immense optimism. So I think the real consequence of the Last Supper, in many ways, we've lost the plot on what happened. The facile explanation is we went from 51 primes down to 5. That meant there was a lack of competition in the industrial base, and that's why everything sucks. And I don't think that actually gets at the root of the issue. So we went from, for every dollar we were spending, we started spending 33 cents, very substantial budget reduction. It basically happened all in 1 year. And that consolidation breeds conformity. Because we forget that it wasn't Northrop Grumman, it was Jack Northrop and Leroy Grumman. That actually there were these larger-than-life entrepreneurs, innovators, engineers who were really driving this industrial base. And this consolidation really drove them out of it. It was the beginning of the financialization of defense and a whole different sort of shape of defense company that came out of this almost, very artificial consolidation process. The reason to be optimistic is that you now have Palmer Luckey. You now have hundreds of founders and entrepreneurs that are back on the playing field with wildly heterodox ideas that are not just being yes men to what the program offices are asking for, but actually investing their own capital into R&D, not on the cost plus addiction cycle, to deliver fundamental innovation. And that's what it used to look like. When we were building ICBMs, the services were competing against each other. And the greatest loss of we tell ourselves this thing that we can't afford duplication. And that's one of the ways in which we implicitly are shorting the free market system. And it's not duplication, it's competition. And do you think competition is going to drive to better, cheaper ideas? Do you believe technology is a force for transformation, or is it kind of beside the point?
But I want to come back to the phrase that you used at the beginning, which I'm sure is familiar to most people in the audience, the valley of death, which is what people trying to sell to the Pentagon describe as the gap between development, and there's a lot of innovative development. DARPA and so many other agencies have tried to sponsor good ideas, and production at scale, deployment throughout military service. I'm still not sure I understand how you propose to get across that valley of death.
At Palunteer, over the last 2 decades, there are probably like 10 major efforts I've been involved with that are really going from 0 to 1 to 1 to N. The first couple of times I went through that, it sucked. And it was interpersonally frictionful. The people on both sides of this divide hated each other. And there's a human proclivity to say like, oh, there must be a process. There must be some way that I can make this transition less painful. And I came to the conclusion around the 3rd or 4th time, like, no, there is no process. Any attempt to put a process on this just kills the innovation. That actually, it is a messy, chaotic process to get from this side to that side, and you have to get through it with like sheer will. It takes a Rickover-like figure. It takes real leadership. There's no amount of process that will do it. So I think actually the problem is that we've been praying at the altar of process for too long, and then we keep adding barnacles of bureaucracy to that process, thinking that it will make it better, and it only makes it fail with more certainty. When David Packard, Silicon Valley founder, created the 5000 series, it was 7 pages. It's now more than 2,000 pages. That's a compounded growth rate of 11% a year. That's pretty, it's the only way in which the DoD is beating the market.
So again, to come back to the fundamental question, do you have to have new legislation or some other way to essentially shred the layers and layers of requirements? The process is all codified in law. How do you get
some of it's statutory, a lot of it is regulation. A lot of it is kind of self-imposed barnacles bureaucracy. And I think the answer to what ails us here, how you break that monopsony, is strong leadership. We have to give people discretion, just like we would in our companies. When you're betting on a product leader or an engineering leader, they're going to have to learn from their mistakes. I think things like DOPMA, or where we're rotating around our uniform service members every 2 to 3 years, is a disaster. You're not even in the role long enough to know you made a mistake that you're going to learn from. And I think this stuff compounds over time. So I think it really does. It's not about more defense reform. It's not about statutory changes. It's about empowering our people and betting on them. So when you think about the distribution of outcomes, you can't lop off all of the bad outcomes without also lopping off all the good outcomes. That's how it works. So we've kind of locked ourselves into, we've constrained ourselves into having mediocre outcomes at best.
So let's talk a little bit about your company, Palanteer. Share with this audience how your software products can help a smaller defense company, a company that wants to innovate, be more productive and have opportunities in this space that wouldn't otherwise be available.
Well, one of the things I'm most excited about and where I'm spending a lot of my time is on this offering that we call Warp Speed. So for the better part of 15 years, half of our business is really commercial, and we build every Airbus, every Chrysler, every BMW, every HD Hyundai ship. For a lot of that time, we've kind of had to borrow a phrase from our adversary, hide our strength and bide our time. Because it's been very clear that the manufacturing stack that legacy manufacturers use doesn't work. If you go to the factory floor in Detroit, they're so proud of their ERP system, but on the factory floor, they're using Excel. So how good could it really be? There was a huge mark-to-market moment with COVID and the supply chain crisis. People had been spending tens of billions of dollars in their supply chain software, and it all fell over like a paper tiger. If you go back to the earnings calls, what were CEOs talking about as the tech investments that saved them? Zoom, Teams. I mean, what an indictment of the software industrial complex. And that was the first moment that we could be more honest, that we think the software stack has failed, and that you might be really wedded to your legacy providers, but you need to reimagine this whole thing. What's really exciting about the present moment is for the modern American manufacturing companies, the people that are in this room, they already know the software stack is a fraud. There's a reason Elon built his own stack from scratch to do this. So we're talking about people who grew up directly or indirectly in the school of Tesla and SpaceX and already know they got to reimagine how to do this. So there's been a huge opportunity to help people integrate the whole process from PLM to ERP to MES to their CRM to actually give them real agility in terms of how they build what they're building and how quickly they can iterate on designs and manage the cost of those changes and how it flows through to delivery. So, Anduril has built their production infrastructure entirely on top, or manufacturing production infrastructure entirely on top of our offering here. Shield AI, Epirus, Saildrone, Saronic, and I think it's a massive accelerant to their ability to scale as the government starts making big bets in doing this.
So take this a little further. I've talked with Palmer Luckey about his idea that you need to fundamentally change how you manufacture things for the defense market to bring costs down. That we're building these ridiculously exquisite, is the phrase the Pentagon always uses, Cadillacs, when what we need are kind of lots of lower cost products with interchangeable parts. Give us a sense of how that manufacturing revolution to drive down costs, standardize production, might work, and what role your company would play in it.
Well, you need to be able to design. So right now our whole system works where, because we've divided up development from production, you get to one prototype of something that's truly exquisite and the science and engineering behind it is amazing, but you're going to be able to build 10 of them, and you may not even be able to afford 10 of them. And in the commercial world, the word design for manufacturability is how you do everything. So you're actually thinking about the fact that you're going to need 10,000 of these things up front and how you design it. And then how you iterate on the design is always about incrementally improving your ability to produce those things at scale and at the cost at which it costs to make those things. And so a lot of this is about closing that cycle time. In software, you think about it like a CI check. And when you change your design, what are the consequences for manufacturability? How do you actually co-locate your R&D engineers closer to the factory floor so that you're changing that feedback loop in a very fundamental way? A lot of that breaks the conventional thinking in the Pentagon, where you want to lock in your design and then just go build these things. And I think some of that is just an opioid. It's a desire to avoid pain, the complexity of making changes. But when you do that, actually, you realize you've changed your frigate design in a way that now the center of gravity is completely wrong and the thing might not float. But by the time you figure that out, it's too late. You needed to figure that out at the point of design, not at the point of production.
So you talked earlier about some of these charismatic founder figures. You have a blog on Substack that I think you call First Breakfast.
Yeah, the antidote to the Last Supper.
So the Last Supper, and then now we're going to have the First Breakfast. But one of the features of this, if people haven't looked at it, is something you call heroes and heretics. And it's people, like these oddball, sometimes domineering founders. Some of the people you profile are the famous Admiral Hyman Rickover, Senator John McCain, who so many of us remember fondly, Kelly Johnson, who built the Lockheed Skunk Works, Air Force Colonel John Boyd, who coined the term the OODA loop, and you go into who the person who figured out the OODA loop was. But I want to ask you, as you've reviewed these extraordinary personalities, what they have in common in terms of their intellectual traits, the way that they confronted the bureaucracies in which they operated. What is it, if you were to give 2 or 3 personality traits that makes people like this capable of such extraordinary performance?
I think they're founders. I mean, to use a word that I think people in Silicon Valley would recognize, and for those of us, I'm not a founder. You know, I've worked for incredible founders, but there's a huge amount of vision. There's a huge amount of talent. There's an ability to manage the talent around them and almost create that reality distortion field. I think what they also have in common, the reason I called it Heretics and Heroes, is that they are difficult people. You know, Boyd was famously abrasive. There's a reason he couldn't make general. Rickover required the protection of the entirety of Congress. But the nuclear navy he built is one of our last remaining asymmetric advantages, even now, even though he did that thing in the 60s. You know, it's truly incredible. Danny Gold, you know, when he built the Iron Dome, technically it was like an illegal procurement, and they were ready to throw him in jail. Fortunately for him, I think it was well timed. There was a missile barrage where the dome performed excellently, and he became a national hero. You know, Edward Hall, I wouldn't recommend anyone do this, but Edward Hall had to fake a Soviet intelligence report about missiles in order to get the Minuteman funded. There's a way in which, like, our anodyne retelling of history is like, look, if you just follow the process, everything works. But I think if we look at our really big successes, everyone had to break the process, including Bill Perry. He got stealth done. He got GPS done. He got those things done around PPBE. Bill Perry was looking at the problem. He said, hey, I can either fix the system, and I'm going to get bogged down in trench warfare and probably fail, or I can go around the system and make sure the most important things that the nation requires do succeed.
So if there, you know, you'd have rules for founders, rules for heretics for right now, what would 2 or 3 of them be? What are the things that people in this audience, the people they work with, need to do that will allow them to innovate in a world that still has so many obstacles?
A delayed answer to your question, which answers this question as well, is the primacy of winning. You know, what all of these people have in common is that they were working backwards from what was required to win. And as we look, we are in the 11th hour here. You know, how prepared are we for 2027? How prepared are we for a world where we've lost deterrence? What are we actually working on that will be delivered in time in a way that provides any meaningful value to the force? These are questions I think these folks woke up every day trying to answer for themselves. Those are the heretics, the heroes and heretics of our future are doing that exactly right now.
I like that. It's a takeaway for me, the primacy of winning. We have just over 3 minutes left. I want to ask you to speak about a subject that's vastly complex, but is crucial to your company and to everybody in the audience, and that's AI. From where you sit as Chief Technology Officer for Palantir, extraordinarily advanced tech company, what's the AI challenge that interests you the most? And I'd also be interested in what the obstacle or difficulty / danger that concerns you most.
If you think about AI, you can divide it up into supply and demand. And I think we spent a lot of time and capital, and we need to continue to spend more on the supply side, building the models. But we have not spent enough time or energy organizing around the demand side. How do we use these models for economic or mission advantage? And that's where I think the opportunity actually is. At the beginning of the AI revolution, there's kind of a question of what's going to be most valuable. Is it going to be building a co-pilot that augments an existing human's efforts, maybe 20%, 50% better? Or is it going to be automation, autonomy, that makes them 200 times better? I think it's very clear at this point the answer is the latter. And then if you think about that journey, we can reason about it by analogy by looking at self-driving cars. You know, we had a self-driving car that drove through the desert 120 miles in 2005, the DARPA Grand Challenge winner. What have we been doing for 20 years? I think one way of framing it is we've been handling edge cases. You know, there's just a lot of edge cases between that and a commercial self-driving car service, which arguably we now have. And I think as we think about the journey for enterprise autonomy, That's actually what we need to be focused on, which is how do we build the infrastructure that enables us to accumulate and handle the edge cases? Where are the big national investments that we actually need to make so that we can get really good at doing this? I think if we just divide this up, there's a reason that there are only a few big winners in the commercial self-driving car space. The government probably needs to make a concerted effort to collect every sort of AI int, if you will. Every sort of sensor inference that's happening at the edge today, we throw that away. And if we really want to outpace our adversary, if we want to have the best possible OODA loop, which is really what drives deterrence, we need to really organize around this problem.
So that's what we should do. We've got a minute left. What's the thing that we shouldn't do? And by we, I mean, in particular, government overseers of the technology, but also companies making investments.
One of the beautiful things about Rickover's journey is he was both responsible for developing the nuclear Navy's technology and coming up with the regulations for doing it. And he did a really good job. The Soviets irradiated their submariners. They needed 6 months of rest for every 6 months of service, and they all got leukemia in the end. And our Navy's safety standards are 100 times better than civilian. And so I think there's something about if you're really, the right way to think about how are we going to oversee AI has to come from the practitioners who are at the leading edge of developing it. And I think we've probably been on the wrong side of that, where there's been a lot of historic hand-wringing on safety, and it's not really grounded in a reality of what are the actual risks that we're going to face as we implement these things.
So, ladies and gentlemen, Shyam Sankar, one of the most innovative, creative people I know in the technology world. Thank you so much for joining us. Thanks to all of you.
Thank you.